Imagine a handful of lawyers in Washington, late at night in December of 2000, huddled over a stack of papers that almost nobody will ever read. Congress is rushing to leave town for the holidays. The presidential election has just been fought over hanging chads in Florida, and buried deep inside an 1,100-page spending bill is a few dozen pages of dense derivatives language. No big press conference, no prime-time speech, just some modernization clauses that quietly say, in effect, these new Wall Street contracts, we're not really going to regulate them. Fast forward to today, and those clauses sit behind a market of roughly $600 to $700 trillion in outstanding over-the-counter derivatives contracts worldwide, depending on when you measure it. They shape your mortgage rate, your pension fund's survival, and the price of electricity, even if you've never heard the name of the law that set them loose, the Commodity Futures Modernization Act of 2000. And the really wild part is that the key political decisions that created this world were made in the 1990s, in conversations in committee rooms that most people never knew were happening. So let's slow this down and talk about what actually happened, how one obscure modernization deal from that era still rigs the structure of global markets in favor of a tiny group of players, and why we keep reliving versions of the same crisis over and over again. First, what are we even talking about when we say derivatives? Think about a simple example. You're a farmer, I'm a baker, and we agree today on the price I'll pay you for wheat 6 months from now. The contract's value derives from the wheat price. That's an old idea. Futures markets on exchanges like the Chicago Board of Trade go back more than a century. They were tightly regulated after the early 20th century bucket shop scandals and the Great Depression. If you wanted to gamble on commodity prices, you had to do it on a regulated exchange, with margin, public prices, and a cop on the beat. What changes in the late 20th century is where and how these contracts are traded. Instead of open outcry in a pit, big banks start cutting private deals directly with each other and with corporations. These are over-the-counter, or OTC derivatives, interest rate swaps, currency swaps, credit default swaps. They're customized, they trade by phone or screen, and almost nobody outside the deal knows they exist. By the early 2000s, the notional value of OTC derivatives contracts worldwide was closing in on $100 trillion, and then it just kept climbing. Notional value is the reference amount the contract is tied to, not money that actually changes hands, so headlines about hundreds of trillions can be a bit misleading. The real risk is much smaller than that number, but still enormous. The Bank for International Settlements estimated that by the end of 2023, there were about $667 trillion in notional OTC derivatives outstanding. If only a few percent of that goes bad in the wrong way at the wrong time, you have a global problem. Now, for most of the 20th century, the legal framework was pretty simple. Under the Commodity Exchange Act, futures contracts were supposed to trade on regulated exchanges. Off-exchange futures were basically illegal. That was how Congress had tried to kill those old bucket shop gambling operations. But nobody in the 1930s imagined a world where a London swap trader and a New York investment bank are writing sophisticated interest rate contracts by the thousands. When that world arrived in the 1980s, everybody started asking a very uncomfortable question. Are these new swaps actually futures in disguise? And if they are they all technically illegal? Wall Street did not like that question. So in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the CFTC, began issuing policy statements saying, in effect, relax, certain swaps and hybrid instruments aren't covered by the futures rules. Then, Congress stepped in with the Futures Trading Practices Act of 1992. That law gave the CFTC a broad new power under Section 4C of the Commodity Exchange Act, the authority to exempt entire classes of transactions from the normal futures requirements when the parties were sophisticated enough. Using that power, in January 1993, the CFTC adopted what became known as the swaps exemption. The rule said that if a derivatives deal met a few conditions, it was privately negotiated between eligible professional counterparties, not traded on an exchange, and creditworthiness of the counterparty actually mattered, Then it would be exempt from nearly all provisions of the Commodity Exchange Act. The only big things left in place were basic anti-fraud and anti-manipulation rules. At the same time, Congress preempted state gambling and bucket shop laws for these exempted financial derivatives, so a state attorney general couldn't just walk in and say, "These swaps are illegal gambling contracts." That 1993 move is the quiet first phase of the deal. It doesn't completely deregulate derivatives, but it draws a circle around the big private OTC market and says, "You're special. Normal futures rules don't apply to you." And once you grant that kind of special status, it's very hard politically to take it back later. The 1990s then become a decade of growth and near misses. Global OTC derivatives explode in volume. By June 2001, the notional amount of OTC derivatives stands just under $100 trillion, up from roughly $72 trillion 6 months earlier. In 1998, a hedge fund called Long-Term Capital Management leverages around $5 billion of capital into more than $1 trillion of exposure using derivatives. When its bets go bad after the Russian default, the fund is ours, away from imploding and taking a chunk of Wall Street with it. Only an emergency, privately funded bailout coordinated by the New York Federal Reserve keeps that from turning into an outright crash. If you're someone who believes in strict regulation, this looks like a giant warning siren. Here's a largely unregulated derivatives market nearly bringing down the system. But if you're a deregulator in the 1990s, you see something different. You see that the system survived without new rules. And you worry that if one small commodities agency in Washington starts clamping down, the business will simply move to London or to some offshore subsidiary. This is where Brooksley Born enters the story. Born is a Stanford-trained lawyer who becomes chair of the CFTC in 1996. She's not hostile to markets. She spent her career as a respected derivatives lawyer. But she looks at the explosion of complex OTC derivatives and sees legal uncertainty and hidden risk. In May 1998, the CFTC under Born issues a concept release asking a basic question. Should we at least consider bringing these OTC derivatives under some sort of oversight, capital requirements, transparency, maybe clearing, before the market gets even bigger? The reaction from the rest of the government is immediate and ferocious. On the very day the concept release goes out, Treasury Secretary Robert Rubin, Federal Reserve Chair Alan Greenspan, and SEC Chair Arthur Levitt send a joint letter to Congress urging lawmakers to stop the CFTC in its tracks. They say even talking about new rules could create legal uncertainty, undermine the market, and push business offshore. Congress listens. To them, not to Born. In late 1998, lawmakers quietly slap a moratorium onto an appropriations bill, barring the CFTC from taking any regulatory action on swaps and certain hybrid instruments until at least March 1999. That moratorium basically freezes the legal status quo in place. Born's fellow commissioners, under heavy political pressure, refuse to move forward on the concept release. She resigns as CFTC chair in June 1999, shortly after Congress has made it clear that her agency will not be allowed to regulate OTC derivatives. If you wanted to pick a single moment where the United States makes a choice between preemptive regulation and let's see what happens, that fight in 1998 and 1999 is a good candidate. With Born out of the way, the task of fixing derivatives law moves to a different forum, the President's Working Group on Financial Markets. This is a high-level committee made up of the heads of Treasury, the Fed, the SEC, and the CFTC. In November 1999, they publish a report with a very soothing title, Over-the-Counter Derivatives and the Commodity Exchange Act. The core idea is that Congress should give the OTC derivatives markets legal certainty by writing exemptions and exclusions directly into statute. In plain English, instead of the CFTC having the power to change its mind and re-regulate swaps later, the law itself would say these instruments are not regulated like futures. That report becomes the blueprint for the deal that comes next. Now, jump forward 1 year to December 2000. Senator Phil Gramm of Texas, a committed deregulator and the architect behind the earlier Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act that tore down parts of Glass-Steagall, is about to retire. He has one more big financial bill on his list, the Commodity Futures Modernization Act, based on that working group report, is introduced in the House on December 14th. It goes through a blur of closed-door negotiations. Then, just days before Christmas, it's attached to a massive year-end appropriations package and passed with very little debate. President Bill Clinton signs it into law on December 21st, 2000. On the surface, CFMA looks like housekeeping. It modernizes the Commodity Exchange Act, reauthorizes the CFTC, and allows new products like single-stock futures. But tucked inside are the sentences that matter for our story. Title I of the law says that most over-the-counter financial derivatives, contracts between eligible contract participants, basically big banks, corporations, funds, and a few wealthy institutions, are excluded from the Commodity Exchange Act. They don't have to trade on exchanges, they don't have to be cleared, they don't have exchange-style margin rules. The CFTC keeps some anti-fraud and anti-manipulation powers over certain commodities, especially agriculture. But for financial swaps, things tied to interest rates, currencies, indexes, and credit risk, the law essentially locks in the unregulated status they enjoyed under the 1993 swaps exemption. At the same time, the statute extends and strengthens the preemption of state bucket shop and gambling laws for these derivatives, including new products tied to credit risk, like credit default swaps. Former New York insurance superintendent Eric Dinallo later argues that this decision strips states of a potentially useful tool to treat some of these bets as illegal gambling or as unlicensed insurance. Then there's the part that became famous as the Enron loophole. CFMA adds a new Section 2H to the Commodity Exchange Act that exempts many over-the-counter energy trades in certain electronic commodity exchanges from most CFTC oversight, so long as only eligible commercial entities and eligible contract participants are involved. It effectively says, if big energy traders are dealing with each other on an electronic platform in natural gas or electricity, they can often do it outside the normal exchange rules. Put all of this together, and the late 1990s derivatives deal looks like this. In 1993, the CFTC and Congress carve out a big regulatory exemption for swaps. In 1998 and 1999, political pressure shuts down the only serious attempt to rethink that decision. And in December 2000, Congress locks the exemptions into statutory law and widens them, making it extremely difficult for future regulators or state officials to pull OTC derivatives back under the same kind of strict rules that applied to exchange-traded futures. This didn't create modern finance out of thin air. Banks were already using swaps heavily, but it did something subtler and arguably more important. It told everyone in the market, you can scale this up without worrying that one day a regulator is going to wake up and say, actually, these are illegal. It turned a legal gray area into a green light. The early consequences show up faster than people expected. On the commodity side, energy companies like Enron use the new freedom in Sections 2G and 2H to trade huge volumes of energy derivatives off exchange on platforms like Enron Online. When Enron collapses in 2001 amid accounting fraud and market manipulation, congressional investigations zero in on the CFMA language that left much of this activity outside effective oversight. Eventually, in 2008, Congress passes a Close the Enron Loophole Act as part of the Farm Bill, bringing many of these electronic energy markets back under CFTC supervision. But by then, the damage has been done. The idea that large dealers can operate vast electronic derivative markets with only light oversight has become normalized. On the financial side, the big new instrument of the 2000s is the credit default swap, or CDS. A CDS looks like insurance on a bond or a mortgage security. The buyer pays periodic premiums. The seller promises to compensate them if the underlying asset defaults. In practice, it often functions as a way to make leveraged bets on whether bonds will fail, even if you don't own the bonds yourself. Between the late 1990s and 2008, the CDS market grows from almost nothing to tens of trillions of dollars in notional value. Because CDS are treated as swaps, not insurance, the companies selling them aren't required to hold the same kind of reserves an insurer would need to back up a pile of life policies. All of this is happening in the legal space the 1990s deal cleared out. When the subprime mortgage bubble bursts, that web of unregulated CDS turns what might have been a brutal but contained housing crash into a full-blown global financial crisis. Mortgage bonds begin to fail, CDS sellers have to post collateral they don't have, and everyone starts asking who is on the hook for what. The market discovers that one of the biggest sellers of CDS protection on mortgage securities is not a bank, but the financial products division of an insurance conglomerate, AIG. By 2008, AIG Financial Products has written protection on roughly $441 billion worth of debt, including about $57.8 billion of securities backed by subprime mortgages. When the housing market craters, AIG suddenly has to post enormous amounts of collateral to its counterparties, mainly big banks in the United States and Europe. Without government help, it will default, and those banks will take heavy blows just as the rest of the system is wobbling. The Federal Reserve and the Treasury step in with an extraordinary rescue. At the peak, around $182 billion in various forms of support are committed to keep AIG afloat long enough to unwind its derivatives book. A significant chunk of that money flows through AIG to its counterparties, often paying them 100 cents on the dollar for bad bets they had made on mortgage securities. Goldman Sachs alone ultimately receives about $12.9 billion via AIG-related payouts, much of it on credit default swaps. Could the crisis have happened without the Commodity Futures Modernization Act and the 1990s swaps exemptions? The underlying housing bubble and a lax mortgage underwriting would still have been there. So it would be misleading to say this law caused the crisis on its own. But by keeping the fast-growing CDS and OTC derivatives markets outside of comprehensive regulation, those decisions allowed an enormous opaque layer of bets to build up on top of the housing market. When the bottom fell out, that hidden layer turned local fires into a global blaze. After 2008, public anger forces a partial rethink. In 2010, Congress passes the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act. Title VII of that law is specifically about derivatives. It says that many standardized swaps must now be centrally cleared through regulated clearinghouses, and that trades must be reported to data repositories. The CFTC and SEC are given clearer authority over swaps and security-based swaps. These reforms change the plumbing of the system in important ways. By the end of 2023, roughly 78 to 80% of outstanding interest rate derivatives notional and around 65 to 70% of credit default swaps are being cleared through central counterparties rather than left as pure bilateral exposures. That's a big improvement from the pre-crisis world, and it reduces the risk that the failure of one major dealer will trigger a chaotic chain reaction through thousands of unnetted contracts. But here's the catch. The sheer size and concentration of the derivatives market today still reflect the basic architecture the 1990s deal locked in. Even after Dodd-Frank, the global OTC derivatives market remains enormous. The Bank for International Settlements estimates about $609 trillion in outstanding notional at the end of 2023, with interest rate derivatives alone around $530 trillion and foreign exchange derivatives over $100 trillion. By the end of 2024, some private analyses put total OTC notional closer to $700 trillion. Again, notional value overstates actual risk, but it tells you how central these instruments have become. And who actually holds these contracts? In the United States, large banks dominate overwhelmingly. A 2024 Congressional Research Service report, drawing on data from the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, found that big banks, those with more than $250 billion in assets, held about 97.9% of all notional derivatives in the banking system. The top 4 banks alone held roughly 88% of banks' derivatives exposure. Smaller banks barely show up in the derivatives universe. Globally, U.S. banks now control nearly 28% of the derivatives business in the European Union as well, giving them a dominant position in that market. On top of that, post-crisis reforms have concentrated clearing in a handful of giant clearinghouses and a small club of clearing members. In U.S. central counterparties, the top 10 clearing members handle over 99% of client clearing for interest rate and credit default swaps. So even where trades are centrally cleared, the revenue, information, and influence are still piled up in a very small corner of the financial world. From the outside, this can look suspiciously like a game where the rules have been written to keep the real action inside a velvet rope. This is why many critics argue that the late 1990s derivatives deal effectively rigged the system in favor of a few large dealer banks. By carving OTC derivatives out of the stricter futures regime and preempting state laws, it steered the market away from transparent exchanges and toward bilateral contracts that only eligible institutions can play with. That, in turn, allowed those institutions to build complex, opaque profit machines with the comfort of knowing that, if things really blew up, central banks and governments would likely step in, as they did with LTCM, with AIG, and with various emergency supports in 2020 and 2022. You can see echoes of this dynamic even in more recent episodes. In 2012, J.P. Morgan Chase's chief investment office in London racks up a roughly $6 billion loss from a set of huge credit derivatives positions that were supposed to be a hedge but morphed into a speculative bet. The trader at the center of it gets nicknamed the London Whale because his CDS positions are so large they visibly distort the market. No single law forced J.P. Morgan to take those risks, but the ability to amass such a massive opaque derivatives book reflects a world where big players operating inside that 1990s legal perimeter can still scale up dangerous trades before anyone outside their circle really understands what's going on. In the United Kingdom in 2022, a sudden spike in government bond yields after a controversial mini-budget threatens to topple a large part of the British pension system. Many pension funds had used complex interest rate derivatives and so-called liability-driven investment strategies to hedge their promises to retirees. When gilt prices plunge, those derivatives generate urgent margin calls. Pension funds struggle to find cash fast enough, start dumping bonds into a falling market, and the Bank of England steps in with emergency bond buying to stop what it later described as a potential cascade of pension failures within hours. Again, the details are different, but the pattern is familiar. Heavy derivatives used by sophisticated players, thin public visibility, and, when stress hits, a rush to the central bank for rescue. Today, if you're a regular person, you're not allowed to walk into this OTC derivatives casino and place bets yourself. Ironically, that's often presented as a protection for you. Only eligible contract participants can play, so the public is supposedly shielded. But your life is still tied to what happens at those tables. The mortgage rate on your house is hedged through interest rate swaps. The price your utility pays for natural gas is influenced by energy derivatives. Your pension fund's ability to pay you in retirement depends on the derivative strategies it uses to manage interest rate and inflation risk. And the framework that decides who can write those contracts, how transparent they are, and who has to pick up the pieces when they go wrong was largely nailed into place by a series of decisions made between 1992 and 2000. The people who pushed for that framework weren't all cartoon villains. Many genuinely believed that giving big, sophisticated institutions free rein with derivatives would spread risk efficiently and make the system safer. They worried that clumsy regulation would drive markets overseas. They liked the idea of legal certainty because it meant contracts would hold up in court and New York and London could stay global finance hubs. And to be fair, derivatives do serve real economic purposes. Airlines hedge fuel costs, manufacturers hedge currency risk, pension funds hedge long-term interest rate exposure. The story isn't as simple as derivatives bad, regulation good. But when you look back from where we are now, the 2008 crisis, the AIG rescue, the London Whale, the British pension scare, and a derivatives market still measured in the hundreds of trillions. It's hard not to see that late 1990s deal as a turning point. Instead of saying, "This new market is getting gigantic, maybe the rules from the 1930s need to be updated to cover it," Washington decided to move in the opposite direction. Write the exemptions into law, preempt the old anti-gambling tools, and trust that big institutions could police themselves. Decades later, the structure that choice created is still with us. We now have more central clearing, more reporting, and thicker rulebooks than in 2000, and those reforms do matter. But the fundamental setup remains: a vast OTC derivatives market, dominated by a small club of global dealers, operating under a legal framework that was shaped in closed-door negotiations in the Clinton-era 1990s and locked into statute at the dawn of the new millennium. A modernization that was sold as a way to reduce systemic risk and keep America competitive ended up amplifying the next big crisis and cementing a system where gains are privatized and losses, at the worst moments, are often socialized. So the next time you hear about some distant technical change to derivatives regulations, or you see news about a central bank stepping into bond markets or backstopping a failing institution, remember that forgotten derivatives deal from the 1990s is still doing its work in the background. The casino that was quietly authorized back then is still open, still busy, and still mostly run on rules written by and for the biggest players at the table. If you found this look into the hidden legal wiring of modern finance useful, and you want more deep dives into the moments in history that still shape our money and our lives today, make sure you hit like, subscribe to History and Today, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story.